we're going to be continuing to work with equations involving rational expressions, but this is going to be a special case of that kind of an equation, and it's going to be one that we're going to call a proportion. Let me remind you, you probably have learned this before, let me remind you what a proportion is. First of all, a ratio is a comparison of two numbers. So for example, if we say A is to B, we can write that as A over B. A proportion is when you have two ratios equal to each other. Okay? So for example, if you have 2/4, 2 is to 4 as 5 is to 10. This is a proportion because these two numbers are equal to each other. Notice that I have 1/2 on the left and 1/2 on the right. Whenever you have a proportion, the nice thing is that you can cross multiply. If I take is 20, that should be equal to 4 times 5, and indeed 20 equals 20. So a proportion in general is when equals a number C over D, then what you can say is that when you cross multiply, A times D will be equal Now, if you have an equation involving rational expressions, which is a proportion, that particular rational expression is simplified. So let's take an example. Suppose we have 3 over 2x minus 1 equals 5 over 3x plus 2. This is a proportion because on the left-hand side we have a simple ratio. It's a rational expression. On the right-hand side we have a simple ratio. It's a rational expression, but we have only one term. Reason we have one ratio equaling to the other ratio. And so what we can do is we can cross multiply in order to solve the problem. We could, of course, get a lowest common denominator for the denominators, multiply both sides by that, and solve simplified, if you can remember to distinguish them. So we'll multiply 3 times 3x plus 2, and this will be equal to 5 times 2x minus 1. Okay. However, these are still rational expressions, and so we have to be careful about the domain of the 2x minus 1 cannot be equal to 0, and so that tells me that x cannot be equal to 1/2. 3x plus 2 cannot be equal to 0, and that tells me that x cannot be equal to a negative. To look at both of these values when we have the answer to the problem. So now let's continue. You can see how I eliminated the denominators very easily with a proportion. And so now let's x is 10x, 5 times a minus 1. Both sides, we'll end up with 1x on the right-hand side. And if we add a plus 5 to both sides of the equation, we will end up with an 11 on the left-hand side. Okay, so now what we did is we were able to solve the problem. We have 11x. It's a potential solution until you look and see to make sure that it's not one of the numbers we eliminated. But we see it's not, so then we go ahead and keep that solution. So proportions are very is nothing but two ratios that are equal to each other. So if we have the ratio A over B equals C over D, then we can say that equals B times C, because we cross multiply. A times D equals B times C.